All right, good morning and welcome to our Women's Bible Study. Welcome to our series, Encouraging Truth. We want to give you something to jumpstart your week and hopefully give you something to think about all week long that will encourage you in your walk with Jesus. If you want to know more about our ministry, go online here to womensbiblestudy.com. That'll give you everything you want to know about us. We try to put 2 videos up each week, one on Monday, one on Thursday. To give you lots of content during the week because our desire is for you to know Jesus and to grow up in your faith, and so that's what we try to get done each week. So this particular series was born out of the coronavirus. Everyone was very discouraged, and so we wanted to make something encouraging for you each week. So here is our encouraging truth number 16, and here it is. You really can trust God to do what you can't. And today it's going to be a little odd because it's going to seem like I'm saying one thing, but then it really is another thing. But the bottom line for today, I'll give you a heads up, is that we have to work, and we have to work hard. And then God has to pick up what we can't do. And there's this whole idea of trusting God, but what does that really mean? So we're going to work through that today. I'll show you how this works. Many years ago, Rob was in business with 4 of our boys. They decided to, they had this little office down on 51st Avenue in Thunderbird, for those of you who live in Phoenix. But in order to save money, they decided to bring the business home. And we took out beds and we set up their desks in their old bedrooms. And our home became their office. And so every morning the boys were at our house at 6 a.m. And they would sit, they would talk, they would have coffee, they would talk about the strategy of what their next steps would be with this business. At that particular time, the boys and Rob, of course, worked very hard. They traveled a lot, but they always remembered one thing, and that was this, that this business that they were in was a product of God's amazing grace and guidance in their life. And before we moved into our home office, we had a meeting right before we packed everything up, and we met in the alley behind where the old office was. And for us, it was kind of like this remembrance. It was like what happened with Joshua crossing the Jordan River when they set up those memory stones. The alley became like our Jordan River as a memory stone to remember how they got to the place that they were at, how this business even started. How did we even know that God was involved in it? And it all started when one of our sons played football for Wheaton College in Illinois. Now we live in Arizona, so whenever there was a football game, Rob and I would get on a plane and fly to Chicago. But there was one particular time when we sat down. There was a lady, we had to cross over her. She was on the aisle. She was very annoyed that I must have bumped her. I don't know. Anyway, she was not happy with us. And so Rob apologized to her, like, I'm sorry if we offended you. She got mad. She got up and she went to the back of the plane and got another seat. That was never happened in our entire life. But just as she left, this man came and sat down. And God used this man and that whole scene to change the trajectory of our entire life. And so we sat there and talked about the memory stone of how this business started. And as Rob was sitting on that plane, he was talking to this man. And at the time we had this business in China, outsourcing business, and the man said, why don't you use that and let's do dental? And it was so amazing, and that's exactly what we did. But in the alley, we just kind of pondered. We pondered and remembered everything that God did to bring us to this place. And we just knew that we worked hard and God would sustain it. But then it happened, and we ran out of money. And the business cost us a lot more than we ever thought it would. But we just kept looking back at our memory stone. And we kept saying, God, I know you opened this door. I'm having a hard time believing that you're just going to shut this whole thing down. So what happened is we started to learn what the word trust meant. Trust. Trust is this: a firm belief in the reliability, the truth, the ability or strength of someone or something. It's like this chair that I'm sitting on. I was laughing because right now it holds me up. Now, during the whole coronavirus thing, I just kind of ate a lot of brownies that I probably shouldn't have eaten. So at some point this chair will not hold me. So thank the Lord, it's kind of over with and we're kind of getting back to our life. But that's what trust is. It says, I'm sitting in this chair and I'm trusting that it's going to hold me up. And so with our business, that's what we did. We put our trust in God to keep our business going. And we knew that he was very reliable, and we knew he had the ability to keep the business going. But we also knew this. We also knew that we had to do our part. But we had to do our part knowing we're not going to trust in the ability of our part, but we're going to depend on God. So it's this twofold thing, like we do what we're supposed to do, and God needs to do what we can't do. And all through the Bible, we see men and women who did the exact same thing. They had to work diligently doing what God asked them, but in the end, they had to completely trust and rely on him to complete their task. Here's some examples. God appointed Moses to go get the Israelites out of Egypt. He appointed him to go confront Pharaoh. That was what God called him to do, but Moses would have to do his part. He would have to get up, walk to Egypt, confront Pharaoh, open his mouth. But Moses had a speech impediment. And so he had to do what he had to do, which was go do what God called him to do, get to Pharaoh. But then he had to trust God. Trust God to speak through him, to speak through his brother, and honestly trust God that Pharaoh would not kill them on the spot. It's like Noah. God gave Noah the responsibility of building a boat, which meant Noah would have to get wood, hammers, nails, and actually for 100 years hammering to build a boat. But when it came time, God would have to fill the boat with animals. And Noah would have to rely on God to do that part of it. And then Noah would have to rely on God to keep their family safe as the flood was hitting and make sure there was no leaks in the boat. So it's this whole, we do our part, but God really does have to finish it and come through with his part. Isaac, I love the story. Isaac needed a wife. And so Abraham, his father, didn't want Isaac to find a wife from the place where they were at. He wanted a wife to come from his homeland. And so he asked his servant to go find a wife for his son. But the servant had to do that. He had to get his camels. He had to take this long trip back to Abraham's original homeland. And then, once he got there, he had to trust God to do what he couldn't. And this was his prayer. God, I want you to bring this wife for Isaac, but I want her to come out. I want her to say these specific words to me, and then I'll know that it's really her. And that's exactly what God did. But it's not something the servant could do. He did his part by getting there, but then God had to fill it in with what he only could do. We see this with Jacob. Jacob and Esau were two sons that Jacob stole Esau's birthright. And then he had to go on the run because Esau was going to kill him. And many, many years later, Jacob was on his way back to his land, and he hears his brother with hundreds of men are coming to confront Jacob. And Jacob was terrified. And he didn't know if his brother was coming to kill his family and to kill him, his pent up anger for all those years. So what he did was he sent gifts. He had someone send sheep ahead of the time and maybe goats ahead of the time, like in front of the caravan, to kind of soften up his brother. He did what he could do. But then he had to rely on God to turn the heart of his brother not to kill him. We see this with Moses. He led millions of people out of Egypt. And yet when they came to a sea, Moses couldn't part it. So he had to trust God that God would. Joshua, think about that. God says, walk around the city of Jericho 7 days. So Joshua did his part. He said, come on guys, we're walking around Jericho for 7 days. And God says, then blow your trumpets and the walls will come down. See, it's like Joshua did his part, God did his. Samson, Samson was just kind of not that great of a guy, but he lost all of his physical strength because he just loved women too much and the wrong kind of women. And he was so powerful, and then he lost every bit of his strength, and they got him and they took him as prisoner and they gouged out his eyes. But you know what he did? They set him up in this for sport, actually, to laugh at him. And there were these two pillars, and he knew that he didn't have strength. So he positioned himself between these pillars. And he did what he could. He's blind, people are laughing, but he did what he could. And then he prayed. And he said, God, I pray for strength one last time so I can push these pillars over and destroy these evil people. And so he did what he could do, and God did what he could. See how that works? It's so cool. It's like so many people will just be like, well, no, I'm just waiting for God to do that. Well, I don't know. I think he wants both. He wants you to do your part, and he'll come through and do his part. We see Samuel. God says, Samuel, go to the house of Jesse, and there's 7 sons. There's one of them that's going to be king. And 7 sons were paraded in front of him. Samuel did what he was supposed to do, but God had to make it so apparent to Samuel which one of those 7 would be king. Daniel was thrown in the lion's pit, but you know what? He was there. All he could do was pray and trust God to protect him. Mary was told by an angel that she would be the mother of the Messiah. And all she could do is trust that God would soften the heart of Joseph or soften the heart of her parents to understand what was going on. And see, for all of these examples, we see people who did their part, but then they had to stop and finish and rely on God to do his. And that's really what trusting God is all about. They did what God asked them to do, but the final results meant they had to wait for God to come through with what he wanted. For our boys, this is what that meant. They had to work hard, call on customers, send out emails, address, envelopes, stuff the envelopes, send them out, work through problems. For me at the time, you would laugh. It was awesome. I was in charge of baking cookies. So I baked Nestle's Toll House chocolate chip cookies. We put them in bags, and then the boys would take them to the dentist's office in order to get the dentist's office. I always loved it. It was like 1 cookie for me, 3 cookies for the boys, 1 cookie for me. It was like the perfect job. But we knew that after the boys took the cookies in to the dental office, that here you go, it would be God's job to move on the hearts of those receiving the emails, flyers, and cookies to give us our business. Like we could do our part, but God had to give us favor with those dental offices. And he did. And it was amazing how the business grew because the boys did their part and we trusted God to do his. When we were going through this time of learning what it meant to trust God, I came upon Psalm 22, and it was in the Amplified Bible, and it literally kind of changed my life. It says this, our fathers trusted in you. They trusted, and here was the Amplified definition of trusted. They leaned on. They relied on you and were confident, and you delivered them. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted and leaned on and confidently relied on you and were not ashamed or confounded or disappointed. And so we learned from this passage what it meant to trust God, to rely on him, to lean on him, to be confident that he will come through. But it also says that they cried out to you. And I think that means our job is to cry out to God, to pray for what we know. But here's what we have to get to. That in the end, we have to be confident that he will do what needs to be done. Because here's the problem with trusting. A lot of times what we're praying for and trusting God for, his answers were often different than what we thought they should be. See, this is why this whole idea of working, trusting, we have to really understand this part of it. Because it's so exciting to read the Bible where God always comes through for the people in the manner that they're praying. God, part the Red Sea, parts. God, crumble the walls, it's crumbled. But many times, God does something completely different. And we have to believe and we have to lean on and rely on God, but sometimes it doesn't turn out how we want it to. The marriage ends up in a divorce. The disease is not healed. The child can't get off drugs. The pregnancy test is negative once again. The relationship that should have ended in marriage has now broken up. The dream job has been given to someone else. And see, what we need to know is that if we're trusting God for those things, and then our prayers don't really come to fruition how we thought it was, then we sit back and we say, well, then what am I even trusting God for? Like if he's not going to do what I want him to do and what I'm trusting him to do, then what is the point? But we have to be reminded of this. As followers of Jesus, we have given our lives to him, and in doing so, we have given him the authority to move us where he would have us go. See, Jesus himself experienced this. He says, I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will and purpose, but to do the will and the purpose of him who sent me. And see, that's what we have to get. As a Christian, our life is lived according to God's plans, not our plans. And so what we do is we pray and we believe and we trust God. But ultimately, we do what Jesus says. God, I just want what you want. And we had to learn that with the business. Like, God, we know you started it. We believe you can finish it. But is this where you want us? And you have to get to the point of wanting more what God wants than what you want. It's kind of like this. When we trust and rely on God, we're saying this. God, this is what I am trusting you to do and what I know I would like, but is this your best for me? See, for us, we believed that God was the author of our business, and we trusted he would make available the funds, and we put our confidence in the fact that he wanted our business to continue, that he alone would open the doors, and he miraculously provided for us. But looking back, we can attribute the success of this business only to God and only to his provision and only doing what we could not. We really took to heart this, Proverbs 21:31. The horse is prepared for the day of battle. That means you do what you need to do, but deliverance and victory are of the Lord. See, this is what we learned. We are to work, pray, trust, believe, rely on, and put our confidence in him. And at the end of the day, we're trusting him for what he thinks and knows is best, because he sees things that we absolutely cannot see. Because when we signed up to follow Jesus, it's his prerogative to do something completely different if that's his plan. And what we have to learn to do is bend our will to his will, knowing he can heal, he can restore, he can, provide. But if things don't turn out the way we think that he should or the way we planned, then we have to learn to trust that he has a purpose. Isaiah 55:9 says this, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts." See, here's what we got to get. Trusting God doesn't mean our prayers will always be answered in the manner we pray, but instead, we believe he will give us his best. Now, that's great in theory. And I can sit here and say that, but you know what? That's way much easier said than done. Because trusting God can feel very, very defeating. We're trusting God to heal someone we know. We're trusting God to miraculously remove our family members from a false religion. We're trusting God to bring back to himself some friends who walked away from their faith many years ago. And what feels really defeating is that up to this point, nothing's really changed. The illness gets worse. The false religion is consuming our family members. And the people who walked away from their faith, you just don't really want to go back. And what happens is our faith and our belief in this big God who can just do anything, we're crushed with unbelief. That's how we feel. So what's the answer? And I think the answer is this. We need to remember. We really need to remember. We need to remember that we serve a God who honestly is in control of everything. We need to remember that God sees this whole picture, that we only see this little tiny part, but he sees something so much bigger. We need to remember that he really can do anything. We see it all through the Bible. He parted the Red Sea. He directed the stone that hit Goliath at the right spot to kill him. He crumbles the walls at the sounds of a trumpet. He heals people with a touch. We need to be reminded that God is still that powerful today. That you can and you should pray that God will bring your spouse back and redeem your marriage. We need to pray and trust that God is capable of healing your disease. That he can provide that job for you. He really can do anything. Matthew 19:26, but Jesus looked at them and said, with men this is impossible, but all things are possible with God. All things are possible with God. But the point that you and I need to get to is bowing our knee to his way and his timing. I love what Micah 7:7 says. It says, but as for me, I will look to the Lord, and confident in him, I will keep watch. I will wait with hope and expectancy from the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. He's waiting, he's trusting, he's believing, but he's waiting. And see, what you and I need to know is we can be praying and trusting, but God's timing is completely different from ours. Think of all the people in the Bible who waited, who prayed and trusted, but David waited almost 20 years to be king. Abraham waited 25 years to have a child that God had promised him years and years and years before. Joseph waited 20 years, never thinking he'd ever see his family again. Noah waited over 100 years to build this boat. Simeon waited his whole entire life to see the birth of Jesus. Moses wandered in the wilderness 40 years. See, part of this whole idea of trusting God is learning to wait for his perfect timing. And that's what we need to learn as followers of Christ. Always remember this. Trusting God doesn't mean we tell God what we want and then expect him to grant our wishes. Because here's what we have to know. Trusting God is so much deeper than that. We have a relationship. It's not like he's our genie and we just say, hey, I want you to do this, or it's your job. He's not the Santa Claus in the sky. None of that. We have a relationship with God where he promises to guide us in the right path. And trusting him means we're confident that he's directing us even if the path is not where we want. We would have learned to have trusted God even if our business had failed. See, trusting in God reminds us that we have to recognize that no matter what happens in our life, everything, every single thing is filtered through his loving hands. And trusting him means that sometimes when he says no, that even if he says no, our faith is never shaken. It's like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we studied quite a few lessons ago. They're getting ready to be thrown into a blazing furnace to their death. And all they could do was pray and trust God to somehow get them out of this predicament. And I love it when they're saying, Nebuchadnezzar says, you got to bow down to this false idol. And they're like, sorry, we're out on that. We're not doing that. But look at what Daniel 3:17 says. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us from your hand, O King. I love it. It's like, I trust God. I believe God. I know he's going to come through for me because that's just what my God does. But look at the next statement. But if not, in other words, I'm trusting him to do this, but even if he honestly doesn't come through because he has a different plan, you know what? Let it be known to you, we're not going to serve your gods. We're not going to worship the gold image which you've set up. And I think that is the whole key to what we're talking about today. If God doesn't come through with what we're trusting him for, then we need to be okay with it. And the reason why we'll be okay is because hopefully we've built this really great relationship. We know and we trust him so well that we know that he has a better plan for our life than we ever could. Psalms 32:8 says this, I, the Lord, will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. Psalm 37:23, the steps of a good man are directed and established by the Lord when he delights in his way and he busies himself with every step. And I'm hoping that today you will do whatever you can do with what you want in your life, but that you will trust God for what you cannot do, because that's the marriage between those two. And then we come under the authority of God and we trust however it plays out. We know that God is our Father. We know he loves us. We trust him with our lives. And I'm hoping today that you will be completely encouraged by that. Have a really good week.